Joe Mullings from 160 Studios here in Delray Beach. And today joining me is the CEO of Limbflow, Dan Rose, and also Dr. Peter Schneider, who is associated with Limbflow. Gentlemen, thanks for joining me today.
Pleasure.
Thanks, Joe.
Dan, always great to see you. We've got a couple decades together as you've navigated your career so well over the years. So it's good to see you this morning.
Absolutely. Great to see you.
Would you share with the audience about Limbflow and as well as your experience and background in Medtech?
Sure, great. Well, Limbflow, was founded in 2012 by Dr. Martin Rothman, very well-known British cardiologist. And it was found with the goal of, kind of solving one of the great unmet needs that still exists in cardiovascular medicine. And that's this plague we have of critical limb ischemia, the lack of blood flow to the foot. It's a result of advancing diabetes and cardiovascular disease. And we still today in the, in the third decade of the 21st century have 125,000 major rural limb amputations going on in the US, which is medieval. I mean, it is one of those major problems that we need to solve. And so the company itself is focused on developing a technology that delivers a new type of therapy using the veins to as the delivery mechanism to deliver blood to the foot. And that's what we've been working on for the past 8 years or so. Myself, I am an American, but I've been in Europe for almost 20 years. And spent much of that, almost all that time in Medtech. Started out on the VC side, then went to work for Medtronic for about 8 years. Started out in cardiac surgery, moved on to coronary and peripheral vascular, and then ran commercial operations for a couple different startups before I joined Limbflow as CEO in 2016, kind of as the first employee, and have been building the company up ever since.
And Dr. Peter Snyder, thank you for joining us as well. Peter, you've been very busy. Recently had been part of an intact vascular sale for $360 million to Philips that I believe, if I wasn't mistaken, the technology was part of your ideation, and also currently co-founder of Cagent Medical, which is a new technology improving balloon angioplasty. So thanks for joining us today, and please share your background a bit with our audience and how it might apply to Limbflow.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. Much appreciate the invitation. I would say, I've spent the better part of my career actually taking care of patients rather than developing devices. And these devices or ideas, they come out of a specific need. We'll be at the bedside or making our rounds and finding things that, maybe we could do, maybe we could solve a problem if we had something new. And yet most of the doctors, they don't realize that these devices, they don't fall out of the sky. It takes years of hard work to put these things together. This particular device, Limbflow, it takes advantage of the fact that the venous system, the veins of the foot, in many of these patients where the arteries are completely destroyed, the veins will still be open and still be there and still be potentially of use to us to turn into circuits to bring blood to the foot. And it's a little bit hard to explain how important this is. It's sort of like the answer that was under our noses the entire time while patients are at the same time losing limbs. And yet it's not simple. And this is where Dan and his team come in. It's not something you just go and do in your garage. This is kind of a complex but important goal that he's working toward.
And Dan, in regards to Limbflow, I know it's been a very busy year for you and the team. It looks like the technology continues to mature quite a bit, and the community's learning a lot now about this technology. Tell me what's happened over the past year. What have you learned in the procedure, and what's ahead, and is there a timeline on bringing this technology to market?
Sure. Well, one thing we've learned over the past year is that patients and our investigational sites need LimFlow. We really saw this throughout the pandemic, where even when they, sites were not able to, treat patients for many maladies, they continued with enrollment into the U.S. pivotal trial, which we're running today. In fact, CMS came out and said, there are 4 categories of procedures that were non-elective, and that was trauma, transplant, emergent cardiac, and limb salvage. And limb salvage is what we do. So, we really saw that sites and patients, that need didn't go away, because you don't want to lose your limb in the middle of a pandemic and spend days in the ICU recovering. So that was a real signal to us about how important what we're doing is. We continue to enroll the pivotal trial and should finish up soon. And that means we should be able to submit to the FDA for approval by the end of this calendar year, and hopefully commercialize in the middle or second half of 2022. So it's really getting closer and closer. That's what I can say. I mean, in terms of evolution and maturity of the procedure, we've seen tremendous progress. I mean, when you think about, as Peter said, these are complex. Introducing a new technology like this, a new way of doing things, is complex. And we really look at, how are we progressing and evolving the procedure? How are we evolving the technology? And how are we evolving patient management? And with regards to the procedure, we've seen, 97% procedural success in our trials. So and that both of those are 2 separate trials, both published. We're seeing procedure times come down. We've seen the first Limbflow procedure in less than an hour. We've, in fact, over the past year, introduced new arterial catheters, new venous catheters, a new stent graft platform, all of which, are, evolutions of what we've done before, but making things easier and faster and simpler as we go forward. And finally, patient management, you have to treat a lot of patients with a new approach before you really understand what those patients need. You have to get experience. That's the only way you can do it. And so working with investigators like Dr. Schneider, we've been able to evolve how we manage the patients after the procedure to optimize outcomes.
Peter, I understand you are an investigator in the Limbflow trials. And what does the data tell us right now about the technology and how it's working in patients? And in your mind, what's the most exciting aspect of this technology moving forward?
Yeah, that great question, Joe. I would say that the answer to that question is best understood by knowing what we had before we had Limbflow. So this is a group of patients that, due to the progression typically of diabetes or kidney problems, they get blockages in the small blood vessels in the foot that are so severe that the foot starts to die on the vine. It's like modern day leprosy. And, we're very good at opening up clogged blood vessels, but we're not good at opening up a circulation that is what we would say is tiny, tiny blood vessels in the foot. So because of that, a lot of those patients go on to amputation. So if you look at a similar population prior to this concept of deep venous arterialization, you would be looking at an amputation rate of anywhere from 70% to 100% by the time 1 year goes by. What we found in the Limbflow data is that with this ability to reroute or recircuit or rejigger the circuit with blood going from the artery system, wherever the artery system clogs, into the vein system to bring blood into the tissue, into the foot to heal the wound, what we're finding is that anywhere from 70 to 80% of those remain amputation free at 1 year. So we're talking about completely flipping the tables from almost everybody getting an amputation to only a minority of patients getting an amputation by the time you follow them for 1 year. So, to me, as somebody who's really presided over some of these situations where I felt like I essentially had no option, no way that I could help this patient keep their leg, to a situation where, it takes time and it takes all this data gathering and it takes all this investigation and development, but there is light at the end of the tunnel for this population. And the early data really, really looks promising.
Dan, this is an enormous market, right? When we think about, especially the diabetes market, I think 18% of the US's GDP is spent on healthcare. Of that 18%, 80% of that spend is in chronic management of disease. Massive market. Now, in your earlier career, you were in the TAVI market, if I'm not mistaken. Another massive market that most people didn't pay a lot of attention to in the beginning of. And we know where the TAVI market is today, billions of dollars. Any analogs between the two markets? Would you go out on a limb and chat about that?
Yeah, it's quite interesting. Sometimes you have flashbacks, you see things and you think, wait a minute, that looks a lot like something I saw before. And, Limbflow is doing something similar right now that's similar to TAVI. I mean, TAVI, when we started out, the surgical valve replacement is the gold standard. And surgeons spend years and years and years learning how to implant a new aortic valve. And then, a couple different inventors, but came along and said, well, why don't we put this valve on a catheter, kind of pass it directly up the femoral and, expand it into the aortic annulus, and boom, maybe that's a solution. And there was a lot of questioning as to whether that was the approach. And they originally in TAVI went after what we called the extreme risk patient population back then, which was essentially an inoperable 100% mortality patient population. And, TAVI proved itself that it could, save the lives of those patients. And if it works in those patients, then slowly, with tremendous amount of clinical data and market development and the input of physicians, improvements of technology, et cetera, it slowly began to find its place in a broader segment of the population. That's why it's grown to where it is today. And Limbflow is doing something similar in the sense that, using a vein to supply blood, to perfuse blood in the foot, it runs counter to some of the most basic things you study in anatomy. And so, but if we can prove that it works in the most sick patients and the patients that are going to get an amputation, then ultimately there is the opportunity to take that principle and expand it into patients that aren't succeeding today with classical therapies. And there are many, many of those patients, and the science is telling us increasingly, including the new, looking at medial artery calcification and small artery disease. There is a big subset of patients who simply don't heal and don't do well. And I think there is an aspect you mentioned about the cost that really jives with what we're thinking about with Limbflow, and that's wound healing. For us, a patient succeeds when they completely heal their wound. Wound healing is a tremendous kind of unseen cost to the healthcare system, but it also means the patient's constantly coming back, constantly getting further treatment, and constantly has a hole open for infection, which often leads to amputation. So in our mind, as you say, if we can think about what is really important for the patient, and that's wound healing and complete wound healing, if we can show that in this trial, we're winning.
You had mentioned, and Peter, this question is for you. Dan had mentioned the early days of TAVI where there were some specialty skilled surgeons who had learned a procedure, had perfected it, but again, maybe were the upper echelon being able to pull it off until the full TAVI came in. From your perspective, with this procedure and extended, does it require specialized skills, extended training periods? From an interventionalist perspective, how does that fit in, which will drive obviously adoption and utilization?
Yeah, you're touching on something that has been near and dear to my heart, which is, how do we train our colleagues? How do we train the next generation? How do I keep my own skills up when something new comes every few months that could potentially benefit my patients? So I'm a vascular specialist. I don't do heart surgery or heart interventions, but I do surgery on blood vessels and also catheter-based procedures on blood vessels throughout the body, outside of the heart. And this has been a constant evolution. So in answer to your question, this is something that, because we have been dealing with as a trained surgeon, I learned my training was mainly, it was really just how to make an incision and replace the pipes, do bypasses and that sort of thing. But early on in my career, it came clear to me that this catheter-based approach was going to be much appreciated by patients, and that eventually it would get good enough. And this is not so much that we're going to stop doing what we did before. This is a consummation of our ability to do top-notch catheter-based work. So I do believe that in order for this procedure to be widely adopted, people will need orientation. They will need to understand the anatomy, the physiology, the steps, but there isn't a single thing we do in a Limbflow procedure that we haven't done something very similar like it. It's a matter of putting these steps together, having the right equipment, having the right knowledge that Dan referred to, of understanding the vein anatomy in the foot, understanding venous valves, where they're located, how to disrupt them, and also just the ability to interpret the angiograms. You know, we're used to looking at the angiograms filling the arteries of the foot. Now we're looking at the angiograms filling veins of the foot. So I do believe that it is not so much that these would be revolutionary new skills, but further development of existing skills for us.
Dan, is there anything that I didn't ask you before we take this out about Limbflow and where the technology is going, timing coming up? We've got the Link show coming, right, in a week or two?
That's right. That's right. Link is coming up, and we have a great training session there that actually Dr. Schneider is leading with Dr. Roberto Ferrarese and Dr. Daniel Van de Heuvel, who are talking about, you know, basically the unmet need, how to do procedures, what we've learned, and what the future is. So, I mean, you know, when I saw the training session, I mean, it just made me smile, because you could see like all of this information and knowledge that is part from us at Limbflow, but mostly from this tremendous community of physicians that's out there helping us along the way and guiding the community towards, you know, really, you know, putting an end to the just unacceptable number of amputations that are going on today. So yeah, Link's coming, and then there's also a big main arena event if you're going to be there on day 5. There's quite a bit of information about percutaneous deep vein arterialization.
Well, exciting stuff, gentlemen. I appreciate your time this morning. I know you're both very busy. And looking forward to see Limbflow and the performance at the Link show. I appreciate the time.
Thanks, Joe.
Thank you, Joe.
This has been Joe Mullings from TMG360 Media and 160 Studios. Be well.